Hello, this is Dr. Christian Lehman, and this is Reading the Victorian Novel. Today, we will be talking about installment 17 of David Copperfield, chapters 51 to 53. And I'm going to do my very best not to break down and start crying. Topics that I'm going to cover today are the chapter titles, Peggotty's narrative style, Australia, with comments on colonization history, both and penal and emigration, a little bit on disability, specifically wheelchairs, a problematic slavery joke, Dora's teasing, a piece of figurative language called litotes, Trifles, and blots, and we'll end with the illustrations. The chapter titles are The Beginning of a Longer Journey, I Assist at an Explosion, where we solve and finish up the Uriah plot, and Another Retrospect, in which Dora dies. Peggotty's narrative style. What I want to point out here is how Peggotty narrates like Copperfield. It was a dark night with many stars a-shining. She was wild. She ran along the sea beach, believing the old boat was there, and calling out to us to turn away our faces, for she was a-coming by. She heard herself a-crying out, like as if it was another person, and cut herself on them sharp-pointed stones and rocks, and felt it no more than if she had been rock herself. Ever so far she run, and there was fire afore her eyes and roarings in her ears. Of a sudden, or so she thought, you understand, the day broke, wet and windy, and she was lying below a heap of stone upon the shore, and a woman was a-speaking to her, saying in the language of that country, what was it as had gone so much amiss? He saw everything he related. It passed before him as he spoke so vividly, that in the intensity of his earnestness, he presented what he described to me with greater distinctness than I can express. I can hardly believe, writing now long afterwards, but that I was actually present in these scenes. They are impressed upon me with such an astonishing air of fidelity. So Peggotty was not there, and yet he describes it as though he were there in a manner similar to how Copperfield describes situations, especially this idea of knowing the thoughts of somebody and then saying what you relate as though it passes before you. Frequently, David will use that phrase as well, that idea of the vividness. And while David can't express it, he has already shown Peggotty express it. So let's go to Australia. This is the chapter in which we start removing the people that are inconvenient to David to Australia. So we will be sending the Peggottys, Gummidge, Emily, and the Micawbers there. First is the Peggottys. There's mighty countries far from here. Our future life lays over the sea. They will emigrate together, Aunt, said I. Yes, said Mr. Peggotty with a hopeful smile. No one can't reproach my darling in Australia. We will begin a new life over there. Then later on, Betsy talking to the Micawbers. Think of this now, both of you. Here are some people David knows going out to Australia shortly. If you decide to go, why shouldn't you go on the same ship? You may help each other. And then David fantasizing about how Micawber reacts to going. Shall I ever forget how in a moment he was among the most sanguine of men, looking on to fortune, or how Mrs. Micawber presently discoursed about the habits of the kangaroo? Shall I ever recall that street of Canterbury on a market day without recalling him, as he walked back with us, expressing in the hearty, roving manner he assumed the unsettled habits of a temporary sojourner in the land, and looking at the bullocks as they came by with the eye of an Australian farmer? So here, what is being set up is a utopia, right? Australia as a place to start anew, a blank slate. However, it's important to remember there were Aboriginals in Australia, and yet we have this idea of the unsettled habit, right? Micawber going will be settler, and the same, he's going to be a farmer, right? No sense here of there having been, or of there being a native population that they are displacing. So a brief timeline of Australian colonization. In 1788, the British first arrived in Botany Bay, modern-day Sydney, and they brought with them smallpox and other diseases like measles and tuberculosis, decimating Aboriginal populations. According to Wikipedia, between 1821 and 1840, 55,000 convicts came to New South Wales, and between 1821 and 1850, 200,000 immigrants came to the United Kingdom. So sometimes I think the penal population takes over the dominant narrative, but it's a lot of willing people that also came. And there was a gold rush after February of 1851 that really sent a lot more people over. Australia is one of the locations that Dickens actually was interested in with Urania Cottage. So by 1853, 30 out of 57 Uranian women successfully emigrated there, mostly to Australia. In Household Words, Dickens published over 100 articles about Australia, and his sons, Alfred Dickens and Edward, who's nicknamed Plorn, short for Plornishmarun Tegunter, both emigrated there. A really nice novel came out in the last couple of years called The Dickens Boy about Plorn. Let's continue with the colonial mindset, which is something that we've actually seen before. So here in chapter 51, Peggotty had said about Australia, we will begin a new life there. And I said about the previous slides that there was no acknowledgement of the Aboriginal population, but we actually did have a foreshadowing of it earlier with Steerforth way back in chapter 21. Why? I was thinking that this evening would be a good time, Steerforth, when they are all sitting around the fire. I should like you to see it when it's snug. It's such a curious place. So be it, returned Steerforth. This evening. I shall not give them any notice that we are here, you know, said I, delighted. We must take them by surprise. Of course, it's no fun, said Steerforth, unless we take them by surprise. Let us see the natives in their Aboriginal condition. So here, a strong settler colonial mindset of coming upon an Aboriginal population and surprising them, not letting them know. And of course, the Peggottys will be emigrating. The Peggottys are not Aboriginals, but we have a conflation of language happening between these two passages. When David goes back to Yarmouth, he meets Omer, who's one of the really important secondary characters we've now seen, who now is in a wheelchair, which is a relatively new contraption for him. I should get up, sir, to acknowledge such an honor as thy visit, said he. Only my limbs are rather out of sorts, and I am wheeled about. With the exception of my limbs and my breath, howsoever, I am as hearty as a man can be, I'm thankful to say. I congratulated him on his contented looks and his good spirits, and saw now that his easy chair went on wheels. It's an ingenious thing, ain't it? He inquired, following the direction of my glance and polishing the elbow with his arm. It runs as light as a feather, and tracks as true as a mail coach. Bless you, my little Minnie, my gray-end daughter, you know, Minnie's child, puts her little strength against the back, gives it a shove, and away we go. As clever and merry as ever you see anything. And I tell you what, it's a most uncommon chair to smoke a pipe in. So here we have another form of disability assistance, the wheelchair. A couple of references to wheelchairs in some images from Dickens. Here in the cover to Little Dorrit, you have Mrs. Clenham, that's there, but then you also have Britannia represented as being in a carriage, being pushed. Here in a closer up, another element of disability being led by the blind. It's a metaphor in the image, but it's also a reference to disability. And then in this illustration from Dombey and Son, Mrs. Skewton is being pushed in a chair. Omer's reference to his granddaughter being an elephant is an allusion to contemporary circus culture. It's also orientalizing. Half a minute, sir, said Mr. Omer. If you was to go without seeing my little elephant, you'd lose the best of sights. You never see such a sight. Minnie! This is my little elephant, sir, said Mr. Omer, fondling the child. Siamese breeds, sir. Now, little elephant. And so, contemporaneous with the novel, there was a very famous elephant, Mademoiselle Jack. This is her here on an advertisement for a circus, also here on a plate. And she has a rather tragic story, caused from captivity and going mad with abuse. She killed several people and was in turn killed, murdered. Dickens drops a triple-decker joke because, again, he can't resist a meta-literary commentary. And since I have took to general reading, you've took to general writing, eh, sir? I give you my word and honor, sir, said Mr. Omer, that when I lay that book upon the table and look at it outside, compact in 3 separate and individual volumes, 1, 2, 3, I'm proud as punch to think that I once had the honor of being connected with your family. So here, there's a couple different jokes. The triple-decker being mentioned is the common way in which novels in the 19th century were published. Dickens kind of popularized and really created the serialized narrative. And so he has his character, David, published in the traditional form. When Omer says, pleased as Punch, you'll notice he capitalizes the P on Punch. That's because Punch was a satirical magazine at the time. And so he's actually making a reference to that. There's a particularly unfortunate reference to slavery here from Mrs. Gummidge. Don't you, dearest Daniel, don't you? Cried Mrs. Gummidge fervently. Take me along with you, Daniel. Take me along with you and Emily. I'll be your servant, constant and true. If there's slaves in them parts where you're a-going, I'll be bound to you for one and happy. But don't you leave me behind, Daniel. That's a dearie drear. Sorry, that's a dearie dear. So here, right, she's saying I would be a happy slave, part of a happy slave narrative that exists, but also they're talking about emigrating to a place that already has an indigenous population. David offers some questionable stand-up about language, continuing with the language of slavery. He's talking about how Micawber is voluble and likes synonyms. I have observed it in the course of my life in numbers of men. It seems to me to be a general rule. In the taking of legal oaths, for instance, deponents seem to enjoy themselves mightily when they come to several good words in succession for the expression of one idea, as that they utterly detest, abominate, and abjure, or so forth. We talk about the tyranny of words, but we like to tyrannize over them too. We are fond of having a large, superfluous establishment of words to wait upon us on great occasions. We think it looks important and sounds well. And as individuals get into trouble by making too great a show of liveries, or as slaves, when they are too numerous, rise against their masters. So I think I could mention a nation that has got into many great difficulties and will get into many greater from maintaining too large a retinue of words. So here, David is referencing slavery uprisings and attributing it to a large number as opposed to their dehumanized condition under a tyranny. Dora is worried early on about being old or being sick. And I think what I want to propose is that her teasing is actually a mode of survival and resistance to what's happening. But Aunt, said Dora coaxingly, now listen, you must go. I shall tease you, tell you let me have my own way about it. I shall lead my naughty boy such a life if he don't make you go. I shall make myself so disagreeable, and so will Jip. You'll wish you had gone, like a good thing, forever and ever so long. If you don't go. Besides, said Dora, putting back her hair and looking wonderingly at my aunt and me, why shouldn't you both go? I am not very ill indeed, am I? And then, a little later, we agreed without any more consultation that we would both go, and that Dora was a little impostor, who feigned to be rather unwell because she liked to be petted. She was greatly pleased and very merry. And we four, that is to say, my aunt, Mr. Dick, Traddles, and I, went down to Canterbury by the Dover mail that night. So Dora is always looking for ways to make other people's lives better. She's very cognizant of the situation, and yet she's using her skills, her teasing, which is her mode of power, to make sure that people go and continue their lives. We have a striking instance when David encounters the butcher, that David is artificially the main character in this novel, but other people are the main characters in their own lives. I strolled into the country for an hour or so and then returned by the main street, which in the interval had shaken off its last night's sleep. Among those who were stirring in the shops, I saw my ancient enemy, the butcher, now advanced to top boots and a baby, and in business for himself. He was nursing the baby and appeared to be a benignant member of society. So here, right, the butcher has had kind of a shadow narrative in this whole story, from their first fight to now being well established. And the butcher doesn't acknowledge or even know or remember David, a really strong comment on how self-centered David's narrative is on himself. Later on in Great Expectations, Dickens will rewrite this kind of scene with a character called Trabb's Boy, who mimics Pip's pretensions. We get a quick mention of Heap's true nature. Though I had long known that his servility was false and all his pretenses knavish and hollow, I had had no adequate conception of the extent of his hypocrisy until I now saw him with his mask off. The suddenness with which he dropped it when he perceived that it was useless to him, the malice, insolence, and hatred he revealed, the leer with which he exulted even at this moment in the evil he had done, all this time being desperate too, and at his wit's end for the means of getting the better of us, though perfectly consistent with the experience I had of him, at first took me even me by surprise, who had known him so long and disliked him so heartily. Here you'll actually see Copperfield unironically fall into that very tyranny of words he had mentioned of mounting synonyms onto synonyms, heaping them up, we might say, but referring to heap as a mask off, right? This idea of presenting oneself to society that is different. And we might wonder, what are Copperfield's own hypocrisies? A brief mention of a new term, litotes. Litotes is an emphatic negation that draws attention to the word being negated and presents a positive through it. Stimulated by the silent monitor within and by a no less touching and appealing monitor without, to whom I will briefly refer to as Miss W, I entered on a not unlaborious task of clandestine investigation, protracted now to the best of my knowledge, information, and belief over a period exceeding 12 calendar months. So not unlaborious means very laborious. And then notice as well, we have that triplicated instance of synonyms. All right, we turn now to Dora. Chapter 53 is a masterpiece of writing. It's 4 pages long, and it effectively communicates the sorrow of the death of Dora. And it does it in a number of ways. It has a really intense present tense, and it uses apostrophe, and it uses a series of these vignettes. And then it also uses a lot of dialogue as opposed to telling. The vignettes have to do with the time of days. On 770, it is morning. 7071, it is evening. And 7273, it is night. In the morning, this is the vignette where Dora says, "When I first began to think about you, I used to peep in the glass and wonder whether you would very much like to have a lock of it. Oh, what a foolish fellow you were, Dodie, when I gave you one." In the evening, "I won't if I can help it, Dodie, but I am very happy, though my dear boy is so lonely by himself before his child wife's empty chair." And we have several references to that empty chair. And then 73, "It is night." And David says, "We have been very happy, my sweet Dora." "I was very happy, very. But as years went on, my dear boy would have wearied of his child wife. She would have been less and less a companion for him. He would have been more and more sensible of what was wanting in his home. She wouldn't have improved. It is better as it is." "Oh, Dora, dearest, dearest, do not speak to me so. Every word seems a reproach." "No, not a syllable," she answers, kissing me. "Oh, my dear, you never deserved it. And I loved you far too well to say a reproachful word to you in earnest. It was all the merit I had, except being pretty. And you thought me so. Is it lonely downstairs, Dodie?" So here, Dora is trying to have a last very serious conversation with David. His response is to say, "Don't tell me. It feels like a reproach, right? It feels like you're scolding me." He makes it about himself, not about listening to his wife. And she responds in a way to make him feel better, with a little bit of reference to her teasing, right? Dora's intuitive, emotional awareness and intelligence so far supersedes David's own. And that also adds the poignancy of these scenes. In a striking instance of clarity and truth, we get one of these Dickensian quotes that really could be placed over a mantelpiece. "I sit down by the fire thinking with a blind remorse of all those secret feelings I have nourished since my marriage. I think of every little trifle between me and Dora and feel the truth, that trifles make the sum of life. Ever rising from the sea of my remembrance is the image of the dear child as I knew her first, graced by my young love and by her own, with every fascination wherein such love is rich. Would it indeed have been better if we had loved each other as a boy and a girl and forgotten it? Undisciplined heart, reply." A couple of references here, right? Blind remorse. You'll remember that we had Betsy say that David was blind, blind, blind. David has confessed his secret feelings to us in his narrative. Down here, Betsy had wondered whether Dora was just a fascination for him, and he repeats that word. He uses apostrophe, that is a reference to something that's not present, his own heart in this case, calling it undisciplined heart, a callback to Annie. But then it's this idea of the trifles making up the sum of life, right? Life is full of all of these small things. And Great Expectations, he will rewrite this phrase through Joe, who will say, "Pip, dear chap, life is made of ever so many partings welded together," right? Here, partings welded together is a reference to Joe's blacksmithing, but also the idea that life is made up of separations. So Dickens constantly almost philosophizing about what is the nature of a human life. Because I don't want to look at the death scenes. I'm just going to go to the end after the death of Jip and of Dora. And Dickens ends on a joke, a poignant joke, but he says, "It is over. Darkness comes before my eyes, and for a time all things are blotted out of my remembrance." When you finish writing ink on a piece of paper, you would put sand down and do what is called blotting the page in order to make it so it doesn't run anymore. Blots are also a reference to when you cry on the page, you create water blots on it. And so we have this kind of double meta-literary commentary as the chapter goes silent. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about this illustration, but I want you to remember that when you would have started this installment, you would have seen this moment with Micawber's joyful reunion with his family, and it would have been directly next to this moment of David. And so a really strong contrast between the joyous and the sorrowful. So here we see Micawber right in the middle, his top hat making him taller, his family energetically splayed across, hugging his wife, who now looks quite young, even caught in the midst of an embrace, right? You see her bonnet flying off, Mr. Dick on the side, David, of course, lurking in the back, and Betsy in the front. But I want to spend the most time looking here at this striking illustration. So we have several things happening. This is Agnes, and this is Dora in the picture, and this is David. Agnes, you see her face looking downward sorrowfully. Her hair is bound tightly, in contrast to Dora, whose neck is revealed and her arms are a little bit more displayed. Her curls are flouncing. She triangulates David and Agnes in an interesting way. She's dead and absent, but she's still present. Her dead body is behind the door. In the window in the background, you see the full moon, but a cloud is coming over it. There's a cross in the back on the top of a church. A reference to the role of the church in marriage and death. We might recall the scenes that we saw in a church, David's marriage to Dora. In the background, you have this figure sculling, rowing, potential reference to the river Styx and the boatman Charon. Here we have a candle that is guttering, right? It's going out, so it's smoking heavily, recalling both Jip and Dora's lives. We have a clock that has stopped, seemingly. And down here, we have David looking, kind of maintaining eye contact with his still alive Jip. There's several dogs in this as well. So in the candle, we have this male figure sleeping next to a dog, looking over him. And here we have a female figure with a dog, right? The kind of separation of the two, one inside the glass, one outside the glass. And then down here in this image, some more references. We have the broken guitar. The strings have cracked, right? So Dora no longer is singing tra la 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 la. David's heart is also broken, the heartstrings. The piece of music is Mozart's Requiem. We have the Chinese pagoda, little reminder of that. But then this eye contact, right, between David and Jip, we're caught at the moment he's about to die, and Agnes has come in to say that Dora is also dead. The chapter is astonishing, and it deserves more attention than I'm giving it here, but it's one that's too serious, I think, to kind of explain through in its solemnity at this time. So with that, we will actually be ending this video rather abruptly. I hope you do spend time with chapter 53, though. It is an absolute masterpiece of Victorian poignancy, Dickensian craft, and the treatment of the death of a character.